American actor and stand-up comedian Richard Pryor passed away in 2005. With his sharp observations and engaging narrative, he was able to connect with a large audience and is now considered as one of the greatest and most influential stand-up comedians of all time. Pryor received 5 Grammy Awards in addition to a Primetime Emmy. In 1998, he was awarded the inaugural Kennedy Center Mark Twain Prize for American Humor. In 1974, he was awarded the Writers Guild of America Award. On Comedy Central's list of the best stand-up comedians of all time, he was ranked first. He was named number 1 on Rolling Stone's list of the top 50 stand-up comedians of all time in 2017. Even though he presents a positive image, there is a startling and terrible side to him. Well then, let's take a deep dive into the legend's dark tragic life, and please don't forget to like and tell us who you would like to hear from next time. Even though Richard Pryor's life story might seem dismal at first, his hardships and tragedy served as inspiration for and fuel for the humor in his act. The real start of Pryor's ascent to the top came when he performed a self-play on stage. He might not have arrived there if not for the suffering and heartache he went through. The 1960s saw a lot of change in both comedy, which had previously only consisted of jokes and civil rights. This is also when Richard Pryor started his career. Pryor was paving the way for revolutionary change in comedy when he took the stage and presented his thoughts, particularly about the realities of Black Americans. Although there was controversy surrounding his use of profanity, it did not deter him from having a successful career in the 1970s. Several Richard Pryor movies, including Blazing Saddles and Stir Crazy, are considered comedy classics, and Pryor is considered one of comedy's greatest stand-ups for turning the sad facts of his life into material for his act. Will It Play in Pryor is a cliché about the Illinois town representing America's heartland. But the reality of the city when Pryor was coming of age was that it was much more crime-ridden than the old adage suggests. Scott Saul, author of the book Becoming Richard Pryor, wrote that far from a blandly typical Midwestern town, Pryor was perhaps America's most unchecked sin city. This was the place where Richard Franklin Lennox Thomas Pryor III, born December 1, 1940, came from. And as anybody who's heard his stand-up routines about his childhood knows, the home Pryor grew up in wasn't exactly Norman Rockwell material. The comedian was raised in a whorehouse, with his mother a prostitute, his father a pimp, and his grandmother the madam who owned a total of 3 brothels. The family also owned a tavern and a pool hall and did bootlegging, too. So much for the good old days being more wholesome. "I saw my mother turn tricks for some drunk white man when I was a kid," he once said. "I saw my father take the money, and I saw what it did to them." One of the women his mother slept with for money was Pryor's mayor. He saw his father severely beat his mother when he was young before she finally left when he was 5. His mother was rough with him as well. Yet Pryor said that it could have been worse. "At least Gertrude, his mother, didn't flush me down the toilet," he said. This wasn't just a comic riff. Pryor once found a dead baby in a box in the house. If growing up in a whorehouse wasn't enough dysfunction in Pryor's life, he also was molested multiple times. First by a teenage boy he referred to as Bubba when he was 6. For a long time, Pryor told People magazine, "I tried not to think of it." In the 1980s, Bubba approached him at an autograph session when the comedian returned to Pryor. "I went out and signed an autograph for Bubba's son," Pryor explained to People. "But when Bubba left, I said to myself, I pray to God his son don't have to go through what I did." His official bio also alleged that a Catholic priest molested him. As the New York Daily News put it, his dad and uncle plotted to blackmail the priest by encouraging young Richard to flirt with the reverend on the phone, but Pryor's grandma put an end to that charade. Not exactly a Leave It to Beaver home life. Pryor did discover something else in his childhood, the ability to make others laugh. When he was in the 6th grade, he was late to school a lot, until his teacher made a deal with him: if he showed up on time, He'd get 10 minutes once a week to perform slapstick routines in front of his classmates. It was his first audience, and it made him want to show up to school on time. Decades later, Pryor would remember that talent by erecting a statue to honor him. Although his quick wit helped Pryor survive the rough circumstances of his childhood, it didn't help him in school. He was expelled from Catholic school when he was 9, after the staff learned of his family's trade. Sent to another school, he hit his science teacher in the face and was expelled for a second time at the age of 15. Never receiving more than an 8th grade education, Pryor was forced to take low-paying jobs in factories or driving trucks, occasionally even resorting to thievery. In addition to continued rejection at the hands of his educators, Pryor suffered further emotional abuse after being sexually abused by a teenage neighbor and later by a priest. As a co-writer of Blazing Saddles, Pryor was also supposed to star in the lead role. The studio refused to give him the part though, claiming his behavior was too unpredictable. Gene Wilder, who played the role of Jim, remembered Pryor missing a writing work day after finding himself in Cleveland with no memory of how he got there. Wilder and Pryor reunited for 1976's Silver Streak, but by the time they teamed up once more for 1980's Stir Crazy, Pryor's drug use was out of control. He was often late to the set, which frequently upset director Sidney Poitier, and on occasion, Pryor wouldn't show up at all. Pryor had decided not to stay in the hotel with the other crew members, isolating himself in order to freebase alone. A local motorcycle gang supplied him with his illicit substances, which he in turn shared with some of the inmates of the prison in which they were filming. Pryor also gave a memorable interview as an attempted promotion for the film, but as he was under the influence, he went off on frequent tangents, claimed the movie is terrible, and asked the interview if he could get fresh with him. Despite Richard Pryor's career success in the late 1970s, he wasn't in a good way, especially after his grandmother Marie died in 1978. Scott Saul, author of Becoming Richard Pryor, wrote that this passing had shattered his sense of himself, and he fell into a profound depression. His world contracted into a black hole dominated by his freebase pipe, his paranoia, and his loneliness. In 1980, Pryor suffered severe burns and nearly died after setting himself on fire. People wrote at the time, Los Angeles police say he was burned by an explosion while freebasing cocaine. The publication said Pryor's lawyer denies the report, claiming the injuries were caused by burning rum. The attorney was technically right in that burning rum caused Pryor's injuries. But as Pryor's biographer Saul notes, on June 9, 1980, Pryor doused himself with a bottle of 151 proof rum and set himself on fire, not by accident, as he first claimed, but by choice. He had lost the will to live. Ironically, setting himself on fire revived it. That's how messed up Pryor's life was. The idea of him burning himself freebasing cocaine was more palatable than what really happened. For a while, no one thought Pryor survived, leading some publications to write obituaries for him. Covered in third-degree burns, he was bathed in antiseptic several times a day and spent hours in a hyperbaric chamber to speed healing. For years, many believed the fire to be an accident, started when Pryor was freebasing. He even joked about it in his act, saying, "One thing I learned was that you can run really fast when you're on fire." Not until a 1986 interview with Barbara Walters did Pryor finally admit he had doused himself in rum and lit himself on fire in an attempt to end his own life. Richard Pryor married 7 times, twice to the 2 of 5 women. He also had untold affairs and relationships with women, including one with actress Pam Grier, his love interest in the 1977 film Greased Lightning. And while Pryor had a lot of good qualities, he also was still fighting the demons of his childhood and was prone to fits of rage. That, combined with the drugs and drinking, wasn't exactly a good match. The New Yorker reported that Pryor regularly beat up women. He also had a thing for guns, shooting up both a car and a fish tank. His then ex-wife Jennifer Lee Pryor was interviewed in 1986 in People magazine after the first divorce about Pryor's semi-autobiographical film JoJo Dancer, Your Life is Calling, describing the movie as a vacuous film, and calling Pryor out as an abuser, saying that it didn't reflect how his life really was. You told me you watched your father and the pimps beat up the prostitutes, as if they owned them and had the right to hit them. You told me it was that macho myth that made you think beating up women was the way to be a big, strong man. I know, I have the bruises and the hospital records to prove it. Nothing funny about that. Yet she still ultimately remarried Pryor and remained with him until his death. In his memoir, he referred to one relationship as homosexual. He described a transgender friend who resembled Josephine Baker. He wrote, "I discovered that she was a he. For some reason, I didn't care, but after 2 weeks of being gay, I went back to life as a heterosexual." Then he talked very graphically about a sexual relationship he said he had with a boy named Wilbur Harp in 1952, when he was 12. In the mid-1980s, after Richard Pryor had quit drugs, he started mysteriously losing weight and looking frail. Rumors swirled around him that he had AIDS, and even Barbara Walters once asked him about it in a 1986 interview. He denied it. Turns out it wasn't AIDS. It was multiple sclerosis, which developed in him when he was 46. For the next 2 decades of his life, he would battle the disorder. In his last 2 films with Gene Wilder, Pryor was visibly struggling to deliver his lines and appeared very frail. He was still planning to go on another tour in 1992 and made appearances at Los Angeles' Comedy Store. Due to multiple sclerosis, Pryor was unable to stand on stage and enlisted the help of an easy chair to get through his performance, eventually using a wheelchair to aid his mobility. Before the tour started, however, Pryor realized the work was wearing him too thin and decided to cancel. But making people laugh meant everything to him. "It's the only thing in my life that's never hurt me," is what Pryor once said about comedy. "That's given me fulfillment. And let me have my dignity. Never belittled me." He kept on trying to laugh through the pain of multiple sclerosis until his death in 2005. Richard Pryor publicly endured multiple sclerosis, notable for its debilitating and devastating physical and neurological effects, which he discussed at length in People in 1995, a decade before his death in December 2005. But it wasn't that disease that ultimately claimed the life of the comedian, actor, and writer, nor was it the effects of his long, well-documented substance abuse issues. According to the performer's business manager, Karen Finch, Pryor's health rapidly deteriorated while he was at his home in the San Fernando Valley of Southern California. His wife, Jennifer Lee Pryor, told the media that the comic had been cheerful in what amounted to his last days. Richard Pryor suffered a heart attack at his residence and was thereafter rushed to a hospital in Los Angeles. Shortly after his arrival, doctors pronounced his death, citing the heart attack as the official cause. Richard Pryor was 65. Richard Pryor wasn't only one of the most influential entertainers in the world for the better part of 3 decades in the mid-20th century, but he was also one of the most widely successful. According to the numbers, his films made more than $800 million at the box office, and that's not accounting for inflation. Among his biggest hits, the 1980 Gene Wilder buddy comedy Stir Crazy, with a $101 million take, and the blockbuster 1983 sequel Superman 3. For his role as comic relief accidental villain Gus Gorman, Pryor earned $4 million, making him one of the highest-paid movie stars in history to that point. And while Pryor filled concert halls and comedy clubs whenever he toured, the recordings of those shows were even more financially agreeable for the performer. According to the Recording Industry Association of America, 3 of his albums sold at least 500,000 copies each, while Is It Something I Said and a Greatest Hits album both sold well over 1 million units. All those record royalties and residual payments on movies he starred in or co-wrote meant the money kept coming in for Pryor after he retired from performing, and even following his death. According to Celebrity Net Worth, Pryor left behind an estate worth $40 million when he died in 2005. Richard Pryor's personal life was robust and well populated. According to Yahoo, he was married 7 times to 5 different women: Patricia Price in the early 60s, Shelley Bonus in the late 60s, Deborah Maguire briefly in the 70s, Jennifer Lee from 1981 to 1982, Flynn Billane from 1986 to 1987 and again from 1990 to 1991, and then once more to Lee from 2001 to his death. Altogether, he fathered 7 children, 4 with women to whom he was married or would marry, and 3 with girlfriends and domestic partners. In order, they are Renee, born when Pryor was 17, Richard Pryor Jr., Elizabeth, Rain Pryor, Stephen, Franklin, and Kelsey. According to Forbes, Jennifer Lee Pryor was left fully in charge of her husband's finances and legacy. She was named the primary beneficiary of the comedian's estate as well as the executor of his image and intellectual property. That appointment was a late-breaking addition to Pryor's will and trust, and Elizabeth, Rain, and Richard Pryor Jr. filed suit against Lee Pryor, which included accusations of elder abuse, exploitation, and financial malfeasance. Lee Pryor came out victorious in the legal battles. Thanks for joining us today. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos.